All right, it's Good Friday, which of course is the day that believers acknowledge the suffering that Jesus went through to pay for the sins of mankind. So a couple of episodes ago, we started this process and we began looking at some of these theories that people have tried to promote to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. The first one we looked at was them saying that Jesus never actually died. He just revived in the tomb and then he somehow got out. So if you missed that episode, go back and listen to it as we talked about that and we looked at all the things that he physically went through. You just see that there's no chance that he survived his crucifixion. Now, last week we took a look at a couple of other theories that have been proposed to try to refute the resurrection. We looked at the theory that the disciples took his body. One thing I didn't mention or didn't talk about is that there are other theories that propose that other people besides the disciples may have taken his body. But they all kind of run into the same problem, right? The tomb was heavily guarded. The tomb ended up being empty. So where is it? And it's an argument from silence. There's no historical proof. It's just a theory. And many of the other groups that could have maybe been behind taking the body would have wanted to produce that body publicly in order to put down this concept of the Christian movement as soon as it started. But they didn't and couldn't do that. And so that's just something to think about. We also dove into this concept that somehow over 40 days, different groups in different places all hallucinated the same thing. Now, again, there's debate about whether or not in the psychological world, whether or not there's such thing as mass hallucinations at all, people all seeing the same thing. But again, 40 days, lots of groups of people, over 500 people in different settings seems pretty impossible to give that theory any credibility. So today I want to wrap up our investigation into these theories by looking at three more of these different theories that people propose. And again, I can't say enough, if your kid is like mid-elementary school and up, you need to be talking about these types of things with them and giving them solid biblical answers so that when they hear people talking about these things, they already know the truth. There's not even a moment of, that sounds pretty good. Like that doesn't even happen. Now, the first one I want to hit on today is the wrong tomb theory. And as you might suspect, this one's pretty straightforward. It is what it sounds like. It's the idea that Jesus' followers got mixed up and they went to the wrong tomb and they found it empty and got excited and declared that he had risen from the dead. Now, what are the issues with this theory? Well, as always, I'm going to take the New Testament seriously as a historical document. Some of you not going to appreciate that. I understand that. I feel like there's overwhelming evidence that it is first of all, that it's inspired, but at least at minimum, it's a historically accurate, reliable record compared to everything else that you accept as history. So that's my baseline, but I believe it's an inspired Word of God. And so I'll get more into that in just a moment. The first issue with this is clearly the tomb where Jesus was buried was clearly defined. Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 through 61, he was buried in a tomb donated by Joseph of Arimathea. So clearly Joseph knew which tomb it was. So even if there was a mix-up at some point, Joseph could have cleared it up, and you would expect that he would have cleared it up. Why would he not clear it up? What's the point in all of these people that claim to be followers of Jesus giving their lives and being persecuted for something that isn't true? You telling me that Joseph of Arimathea watched Stephen get his brain stoned out and he didn't think, man, I got to tell somebody that they've been talking about the wrong tomb the whole time, right? If a well-known follower of Jesus knows for sure that the body is still in the tomb, I feel like that would have been game over for this movement. The second thing is in the very next part of the passage, Matthew chapter 27, 62 through 65, and we talked about this last week some, but it tells us that Pilate ordered the tomb to be guarded to make sure that no one took the body. And so that means that the location would have stood out. Like, what other tomb was being guarded? How often do you need to guard dead people? That's, how often? And so to me, it would have stood out like a sore thumb. You've got Roman soldiers guarding one particular tomb. And if people started claiming that the tomb was empty and that he had risen from the dead, the Romans and the Jewish leaders who wanted to stop this movement would have just needed to point out the correct tomb. and just say, hey, sorry guys, this is the one we've been guarding the whole time. We'll roll the stone back for you. Body's still in there. Again, game over for the movement. The third thing with this wrong tomb theory is another problem with it is that we don't just have an empty tomb. We have witnesses that saw him alive. So that wrong tomb theory, all it does is just say there was an empty tomb, but we're going to give you a really good explanation for it. Not even really a really good explanation for it, but people think so. But the problem is it doesn't do anything for the fact that we have all these witnesses who saw him alive. Obviously, we keep coming back to that, but you have people who are willing to be persecuted and die for a claim that they saw him physically alive in those 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. And again, if you don't trust the New Testament, you've got outside historical sources that also claim that it was widely reported that he had risen from the dead. Now, as I mentioned last week, with all of these theories, they're all just an attempt to throw as many ideas at the wall as you can to see if any of them stick. There's no historical proof for these ideas, and there's certainly not for that one. Now, I got two more to go. The next one is called the spiritual resurrection theory. And this is the idea that Jesus did not appear to his followers physically alive, but rather just as a spirit, like a ghost, for instance. And this is somewhat similar to the hallucination theory, except I guess the claim is here that they were actually seeing something. They were actually seeing something, and it was actually Jesus in a sense. It was his spirit. And so they're being visited just by Jesus' spirit, but he's not there physically. Now, there are two ways to look at this one. Either the disciples saw his spirit after his death, and they counted that as a resurrection, and they were like, hey, this is good enough. We're going to call this a resurrection. And even though they knew he wasn't physically there, or the other angle would be they saw his spirit and they mistook it for him being physically there. So what are the problems with this theory, and especially these two different angles on this theory? Well, the biggest problem with these concepts is it leaves the body in a tomb. Right? Again, we come back to that. So I just see his ghost, or I hallucinate. Either way, like this is very similar to the hallucination theory. Like, so I'm not actually seeing him physically. Oh, well, wait a minute. Then where is he physically? Oh, he's still in the grave. So again, why don't the Jewish and Roman leaders just remind everyone that the body is still in the tomb and put down the movement? Why not? Because they can't. So the second issue is, what about this idea that they saw his spirit and they called that a resurrection? The issue is that the Jewish understanding of the concept of resurrection was physical. When Jesus gets to Lazarus' tomb, he tells Martha, your brother is going to rise again. And she says in John 11:24, it says, Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. At the end of time, his body is going to physically rise from the dead. That was her understanding from her Jewish culture. But then Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, and he calls Lazarus out of the tomb, and he physically comes out. How do we know he physically comes out? Well, he literally has to say, unwrap that stuff from around him. You don't have to do that from a ghost. Now, the third thing, and again, we pointed this out with the hallucination theory, is that Jesus was physically touched by people in his appearances. In John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene evidently hugged Jesus when she realized that it was him and that he was alive. And he says to her, hey, don't hold on to me right now. Jesus ate with people. He encouraged Thomas to touch his wounds if he needed to in order to believe. Listen to how John starts his epistle of 1 John. 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. Here we go. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We have seen it and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. John's saying this was not a ghostly appearance. The witnesses physically interacted with him, according to what John is saying. Now, all right, last week we started a new segment on the show that we called Facepalm of the Week. The idea is we're going to take a look at a post, a reel, a meme, something like that, that makes a claim that Jesus would probably want to make probably would want to make Jesus facepalm. So This week, our local TV news posted a story about 2 former students at our local university that have had their student visas revoked. Now, here's the issue. That should be pretty typical. The article claims that they are graduates, meaning they're not in school at the time. And the way that these laws work, I believe you have 60 days after graduation. You have to either work something else out for why you're able to still stay in the country, or you have to leave. And I saw some local people just going nuts over this. For them, this is totalitarianism. This is where, we've just completely run amok now with worrying about immigration. And the one that really shocked me the most was somebody posted a quote by Martin Niemöller, and it says this: "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I am not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I am not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I am not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Now, let me point out a couple things. First of all, this is a great quote. I mean, it is a great quote about just not paying attention and not speaking out when you begin to see evil in your culture. Obviously, it's a World War II reference. And I hear Christians talking about things like, well, we shouldn't worry about free speech for ourselves. I hear that sometimes. And so you can even kind of turn this thing around a little bit, and they say, well, Jesus wouldn't have worried about his rights, and so I shouldn't worry about my free speech rights and things like that. But the thing is, we should worry about all free speech. If our free speech rights are being infringed, then, as this quote says, eventually somebody else's and somebody else's, until sooner or later there's not going to be anybody to speak against the totalitarianism of the government. And so we literally could kind of rewrite this and flip it in the opposite direction. I didn't speak out because they were only attacking my rights and I didn't think it was Christ-like. But then they began to persecute lots of other groups. That's what totalitarianism does. So no, Jesus wouldn't want us to just be quiet when we start seeing human rights taken away from anyone, even if it's ourselves. Because once totalitarianism takes hold, many people suffer. But the problem with this quote is in the context that it's shared with this immigration story. The message is that we have to speak up against the evil of deporting people because they're coming for us next. However, Scripture is very clear that it is right for nations to have borders and to control who comes and goes. You can pick up my book, Christ and Culture, where I have a whole chapter where I detail what God thinks about immigration and how he handled it in the Old Testament and what he says in the New Testament about it. And yes, there are verses in the Old Testament that say that the people of God, the nation of Israel, that they should welcome the sojourners from other places. So as Christians, whoever lives around you, you should welcome them. You should love them. They say, "Hey, I'm from another country." Great. I don't need to know what your status is. I'm just gonna love you. But it also says that people that get this, that people who enter into that Jewish culture need to accept and follow the Jewish culture and their practices. No one ever talks about those verses. In other words, you can't come in and be pushing something that is completely antithetical to who we are as a nation and who we are as a people and just be allowed to stay. That's also in the New Testament. Nobody ever talks about that. And of course, there's a lot said about nations protecting their people and about nations building walls for protection and knowing who's coming and going. And so, if the rule is you've got to make other plans, or you have to go home after you've graduated, then those are the rules. There's nothing wrong with a nation having that rule. In fact, that rule's been in place for a while, and many, many presidents have enforced it, I'm sure. And so there's nothing immoral about that rule. It's not totalitarianism to enforce an immigration rule. In fact, the news story didn't actually say these people have been deported or are even about to be. It just says that their visas are being revoked. This quote is a massive overkill for this situation. If you wanted to apply it to the U.S. rounding up Japanese U.S. citizens just because they're of Japanese descent after Pearl Harbor, then yes, you're watching people who have every right to be here being mistreated. Absolutely. you speak up against something like that. That's totalitarianism, where a government just starts deciding that a certain group of people who are law-abiding citizens just need to be removed from culture and hoarded, off somewhere. Like, yeah, that's a problem. You should say something. But taking this approach to student visas being revoked after graduation, which again has happened under many administrations, is just going ridiculously too far. So that's the facepalm of the day or of the week. Let's get back into some of these theories. Let's get into this last theory. This one is the last-ditch effort to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. This one is the concept that the legend of Jesus' resurrection developed over time. This definitely comes from people who do not accept the New Testament as reliable historical text at all. So they try to make the case that Jesus was this great teacher. Maybe he worked some miracles, maybe he didn't, but he never rose from the dead. But over time, hundreds of years, more and more people began to talk about him, and more people began to kind of add to the story. And eventually they just started saying, hey, you know what? He rose from the dead. So what are the issues with this one? Well, first of all, we have early testimony. The New Testament contains early creedal statements about the resurrection, such as in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, that's written by Paul around 50 AD. Within around 55 AD, around 25 years, 25 years after Jesus' death. And so the creed, which Paul received earlier, likely he received it 5 to 10 years after the crucifixion, like it literally could be within 5 years, affirms Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and appearances to multiple witnesses. And of course, the Gospels also all affirm the resurrection as well, and were written within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses that could have refuted them. So this leaves little time for the development of legend. It usually takes a few hundred years at least. And we're talking about 5 years. We're talking about 20 years. We're talking about 30 years. Like, there's not enough time. Again, the people that hold this view don't want to admit that the New Testament is a reliable historical source. So before you could use this to respond to someone who holds this view, you would possibly need to talk about how many manuscripts we have and how close they are to the dates that they were originally written, and show them that no other historical documents that they accept as history and reliable have such overwhelming evidence. And so that first thing is you've just got early testimony. The second thing is the disciples' transformation. The book of Acts records that the disciples, preaching the resurrection, they're doing it shortly after Jesus' death, such as at Pentecost in Jerusalem, right there where the events occurred. This public proclamation in a hostile environment suggests confidence in a very recent event, not a later legend. Of course, they all went on to be tortured or killed for their testimony that he rose from the dead. So we know what happened to the disciples from outside historical sources. So how could they be killed for a claim that was never made until generations later? Now just think about that. If you're Matthew, you died somewhere before, AD 90. If you're, everybody but John died before then. Like, all these people died within the lifetimes of people that could have refuted this. And they were evidently willing to give their life for something that wasn't even made up until hundreds of years later, according to this theory. Another thing you have is women as witnesses. The resurrection accounts feature women as the very first witnesses in Mark chapter 16, 1-8, John chapter 20, verses 11-18, which was culturally counterintuitive, as women's testimony was not just less valued in the first century, it wasn't even admissible in a court. So if the story were a later legend, male witnesses would likely have been emphasized to enhance the credibility. If they knew about the culture at that time, or even in the culture a few hundred years later, they would have, if they said, okay, we're going to make this up, we're going to add to this story. How do we sell this thing? Okay, we gotta have really reliable witnesses. And so I love this particular approach because it would have made the story less accepted in that day, in the first century. For them to be walking around going, oh yeah, a couple of ladies saw him first. They would say, well, why do you even trust that? They literally would have said that in their culture. I'm not endorsing that. I'm just saying that's what they would have said. But in this day, it makes it even more credible. The fact that they just said, hey, this is the truth. We can't change the truth. That's the truth. And even though it doesn't look good for us, and even though it doesn't lend as much credibility in our day, we're going to write it down because that's the truth. And so the fact that right away they're claiming that women were the witnesses, the first witnesses, actually adds to the credibility that this wasn't made up later. If it was made up later, they would have chosen different first witnesses. And then the last thing I would just say is, why add to the story? You know, I think we have to ask the question, why would his story be worth continuing to talk about and adding to if he hadn't risen from the dead? There are plenty of people who were great teachers in that time. There were people like Simon the sorcerer in the book of Acts that evidently was able to convince people he had great powers, though he wanted the power of the Holy Spirit that the disciples were exercising because he knew that was the real thing. So why not add to his story? Right? Why not add to his story? Jesus was a non-sanctioned rabbi from a carpenter's family that claimed to be the Messiah. And according to Gamaliel, in Acts chapter 5, lots of people had come and gone on the scene claiming to be the Messiah. And they all came and went. So what made Jesus special? Why would people still be talking about him centuries later in order to even add to the tale of the resurrection? They shouldn't have even been talking about him anymore. The fact is, if he didn't rise from the dead, there would have been no reason for anybody to still be talking about him, even a couple generations. Literally 50 years after he died, nobody would be mentioning his name if he had not risen from the dead. The only reason that we know about him at all is because he rose from the dead. The New Testament would have never been written. The disciples would have never been martyred. And no one would have ever heard of Jesus if he hadn't risen from the dead. So those are the main theories that skeptics present. There are a few others that are really out there that I didn't go over, but those are the big ones. Do you feel like you could have a conversation with someone about these theories and do that with some confidence? Do you feel like you can? If not, jump more into this stuff and learn more. Once again, the evidence is on our side. These other theories don't have any kind of evidence. They don't have the kind of evidence that Christianity has. And here's what's ironic about it, is they don't have anywhere close to the types of evidence that they demand from Christianity, that they expect from Christianity. If you notice, they apply an expectation to the historical accounts of Christianity that they don't apply to any other ancient historical events. They accept things right and left as history that don't have near the documentation that Christianity does. Once again, thanks for joining me on this journey over the last few weeks. Make sure that you subscribe. Even if you don't listen on YouTube, go out on YouTube and subscribe. It would be a huge favor to me and help me tremendously. Listen, have a great weekend celebrating the greatest event in human history, and I'll see you next Friday.